Hey there. Tonight we journey into something particularly grim, the cruel world of medieval England. Forget whatever romanticized notions you have about knights in shining armor and fair maidens. The reality is you probably wouldn't survive your first month in this brutal landscape. So now kill the overhead lights, maybe light a candle, and let's get into some history. The medieval period in England stretches roughly from the collapse of Roman authority in the 5th century to the dawn of the Tudor Age in the late 15th century, 1,000 years where cruelty wasn't just common, but often institutionalized. To understand just how cruel medieval England truly was, you need to journey back to its origins, when Anglo-Saxon tribal leaders carved territories from the remnants of Roman Britain. Life under Anglo-Saxon rule wasn't exactly what you'd call humanitarian. Justice was swift, personal, and frequently savage. Take the concept of wergild, literally man payment, the price of a person's life. Yes, murder was essentially a financial transaction, with your worth determined by your social standing. A nobleman might be worth 300 shillings, while you, a common peasant, might fetch a measly 100. Feel undervalued yet? Well, it gets worse. Thralls or slaves were valued at even less, sometimes as little as the price of a decent cow. Imagine having the same market value as livestock. Actually, the livestock probably had better living conditions. Anglo-Saxon punishment extended beyond mere financial compensation. Mutilation was particularly popular, cutting off hands for theft, noses for sexual transgressions, tongues for spreading falsehoods. They were quite creative, you see, with their justice system. Nothing says, "Don't steal," quite like watching your neighbor struggling to eat with his newly acquired stumps. This period also saw the introduction of forest law, perhaps one of the cruelest legal frameworks inflicted upon the English populace. Large tracts of land were declared royal forests, where hunting was the exclusive right of the king and his favorites. The punishment for poaching the king's deer, it ranged from blinding to castration to death, depending on how many times you'd been caught. Imagine being a starving peasant, your children crying from hunger, a fat deer wandering past your hovel, and knowing that feeding your family could cost you your eyes or your life. That's forest law for you, protecting animals from hungry humans rather than the other way around. Speaking of laws, the Norman conquest ushered in a new legal system that would eventually evolve into common law. While historians often celebrate this as a great English contribution to jurisprudence, its early implementation was anything but just. Trial by ordeal remained common. You might be asked to carry a red-hot iron bar or be thrown into water with your limbs bound. If you sank, congratulations. You were innocent, also probably dead, but at least you died with your reputation intact. If you floated, well, that was proof of your guilt, because clearly, water, that most discerning of elements, rejected your sinful body. There was also trial by combat, where disputes could be settled by beating each other senseless or to death, justice determined by whoever had the stronger sword arm. It's worth noting that women and the elderly could hire champions to fight on their behalf, assuming they could afford it. If not, well, that's medieval equality for you. Then in 1066, William of Normandy decided that England looked rather appealing from across the Channel. The Norman conquest wasn't just a change in management. It was an exercise in systematic cruelty designed to crush Anglo-Saxon resistance. William's harrying of the North between 1069 and 1070 is particularly illustrative. of Norman methods. Essentially, William decided the best way to handle northern rebellion was to make the region uninhabitable. Fields were burned, livestock slaughtered, farming tools destroyed, and villages razed. Contemporary chronicles suggest that survivors resorted to cannibalism to avoid starvation. The 12th century chronicler Orderic Vitalis, who was actually Norman himself, wrote that more than 100,000 people perished, calling it an act of brutality which cannot be forgiven. When your own supporters think you've gone too far with the whole conquest thing, perhaps you should reconsider your management style. The Norman aristocracy didn't just bring new cruelties, they systematized existing ones. The infamous Doomsday Book of 1086 wasn't a benevolent census, but rather a meticulous accounting of every taxable asset in England. Think of it as the Middle Ages equivalent of an IRS audit, except failure to pay could result in having your home confiscated or your body confined. The newly installed Norman lords treated England as occupied territory, and you, the average English peasant, were simply walking, talking property. By the early 12th century, Henry I had established the Exchequer, a sophisticated financial system for extracting wealth from the population. Taxation wasn't based on ability to pay, but on the king's needs and whims. Failed to meet your obligations, the crown might send armed men to seize whatever assets you had, up to and including the tools you needed to work your land. This institutionalized extortion became so refined that by the 13th century, England had one of Europe's most efficient taxation systems. Efficient for the crown, that is, not for you. Religion, that great comforter of souls, also served as an instrument of control and cruelty. The church worked hand in glove with secular authorities to maintain social order. Excommunication wasn't just spiritual, it was social death. An excommunicated person couldn't testify in court, conduct business, or receive help from others without risking similar punishment. You became a non-person, isolated and vulnerable in a world where community meant survival. The early medieval English church wasn't above using fear either. Parish churches were decorated with vivid images of hell and damnation, graphic depictions of demons torturing sinners in increasingly creative ways. These weren't hidden away in obscure texts, but painted on walls for all to see. Medieval psychological warfare designed to terrify the illiterate masses into compliance. Sweet dreams, children of medieval England, don't forget that one misstep means eternal torment. As the 12th century progressed, England's cruelty became more sophisticated, more bureaucratic. The reign of Henry II saw the establishment of professional judges and circuit courts. While this standardized justice somewhat, it also removed local understanding from the process. Judges unfamiliar with local customs or circumstances would sweep into town, hear dozens of cases in rapid succession, and pronounce judgments that could destroy lives before moving on to the next settlement. Justice was swift, but rarely nuanced or merciful. This period also saw the rise of castles, not just as military installations, but as symbols of Norman domination. These stone monsters towering over the landscape were physical manifestations of a simple message: resistance is futile. The Tower of London, begun by William the Conqueror himself, became not just a royal residence, but a prison and execution site whose very name would eventually inspire dread. If you found yourself headed there, chances were you wouldn't be coming back out, at least not with all your body parts intact or your head still attached to your shoulders. So by the dawn of the 13th century, England had evolved from the relatively straightforward cruelties of Anglo-Saxon tribal justice to a sophisticated, institutionalized system of oppression. The groundwork was laid for centuries of refined brutality to come, as kings and nobles perfected the art of extracting maximum obedience and resources from the population while offering minimum protections or rights in return. And that, my friends, is merely the beginning of our journey through England's medieval cruelty. The foundations were set, the stage prepared for even more elaborate forms of suffering and control. The cruel pageant of medieval England was just getting started, and you, had you been unfortunate enough to be born there, would have had a front row seat to the spectacle, assuming you survived infancy, disease, starvation, or the casual violence that marked everyday life. Now, let's turn our attention to the powerful figures who orchestrated much of its cruelty, the kings, knights, and nobles who ruled through calculated violence and oppression during the 12th and 13th centuries. Their cruelty wasn't merely random or impulsive. It was a governing strategy, a way to maintain control over a population that vastly outnumbered them. The monarchy stood at the apex of this brutal hierarchy, and few exemplified the cruel potential of absolute power better than King John, who ruled from 1199 to 1216. So legendarily vicious was his rule that he remains the only English king since William the Conqueror never to have had a subsequent monarch named after him. Think about that, over 800 years, and not a single royal parent thought, you know what would be a lovely name for our future king? John. That's quite the historical judgment. John's cruelties were methodical and motivated largely by greed. When he suspected a wealthy Jew named Abraham of Bristol of withholding money, John ordered one of the man's teeth extracted each day until he paid up. By the 8th day, after losing 7 teeth, Abraham finally surrendered the demanded sum. One wonders whether dental insurance was available in 13th century Bristol. Probably not on the NHS, at any rate. But John's cruelty extended beyond individual sadism. He starved his noble opponents' wives and children to death in his dungeons, used arbitrary imprisonment to extract money from his barons, and was known to fly into rages during which he would chew on rushes from the floor like some royal ruminant having a temper tantrum. This behavior so alienated his nobility that they eventually forced him to sign the Magna Carta in 1215, a document designed less to protect common folk like you and more to protect wealthy barons from a king who couldn't control his worst impulses. Not to be outdone in the cruelty department, John's son Henry III had Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, quartered after his defeat at the Battle of Evesham in 1265, meaning his body was cut into 4 pieces after execution. De Montfort had led a baronial reform movement challenging royal authority, and Henry wanted to make quite clear what happened to those who defied the crown. The message was received loud and clear across the kingdom. Challenge the king, become several smaller versions of yourself. Edward I, known as Longshanks for his impressive height, continued the tradition of royal cruelty with particular focus on the Welsh and Scots. After conquering Wales, he instituted a systematic colonization effort, building massive castles that still dominate the Welsh landscape today. These weren't just defensive structures, but symbols of domination and control, the medieval equivalent of planting a boot firmly on the neck of Welsh cultural identity. His treatment of the Jews in England stands as one of history's earlier examples of state-sponsored antisemitism. Edward initially imposed heavy taxation on Jewish communities, then restricted their ability to earn a living, and finally, in 1290, expelled them entirely from England, an exile that would last nearly 4 centuries. Thousands of Jewish families were forced to leave their homes, with many drowning when the ship captains they paid for passage simply dumped them overboard after taking their money. Medieval customer service at its finest. The aristocracy followed their monarchs' examples, wielding violence as both practical tool and social statement. Knights, often romanticized in modern media as chivalrous heroes, were essentially armed enforcers for the nobility, trained from childhood to be efficient killing machines, wrapped in expensive metal. The process of becoming a knight was itself cruel, with boys as young as 7 taken from their families to serve as pages, then squires, enduring harsh discipline, physical training, and psychological conditioning designed to produce men who could kill without hesitation. Tournament combat, supposedly a noble sport, caused regular deaths and serious injuries. These weren't the choreographed jousts of Hollywood movies, but genuine military training exercises where knights formed teams and battled in chaotic melees that sometimes spread into nearby towns, with locals becoming collateral damage. Imagine trying to do your weekly shopping, only to find armored men on horseback smashing through the marketplace because their mock battle got a bit too enthusiastic. Sorry about your cabbage stall and your now deceased husband, madam. Glorious sport, though, wasn't it? The nobility's cruelty extended into their management of land and people. The manorial system that dominated rural England bound peasants to the soil through complex obligations. As a serf, you weren't technically a slave, but you couldn't leave your lord's land without permission. You were required to work his fields several days each week, surrender portions of your harvest, pay for the privilege of marrying, and even pay a Harriet, your best animal, to your lord when you died, a sort of posthumous thank you for the privilege of spending your life in miserable servitude. Manor courts further reinforced this control. These weren't impartial bodies, but instruments of seigneurial power where the lord or his representative judged disputes and punished offenses. Bias was built into the system. Imagine finding yourself before a judge who is also your landlord, employer, military leader, and the person who profits directly from finding you guilty. Medieval justice at its most transparent. The right of first night, or droit du seigneur, the supposed privilege of a lord to take the virginity of serf women on their wedding nights, may be more myth than reality, but it reflects a broader truth. Aristocratic men often treated peasant women as sexual property. While not formalized in law, the power imbalance was so extreme that refusing a lord's advances could mean economic ruin for a peasant family. Serfdom effectively placed women's bodies, like their labor, at the disposal of their masters. Noble houses themselves were showcases of inequality. Great halls featured massive fireplaces and relatively comfortable conditions for the lord and his family, while servants slept on rush mats in the same space, breathing smoke and enduring cold drafts. The lord dined on imported spices, fresh meat, and white bread. Servants made do with coarse brown bread, pottage, a perpetual stew kept simmering for days or weeks. and scraps from the high table. The physical architecture of medieval England reflected and reinforced its social cruelty. Castles weren't just defensive structures, but instruments of psychological warfare. Take Caernarfon Castle in Wales, deliberately designed with bands of differently colored stone to evoke the walls of Constantinople and impress upon the Welsh that they were now subjects of a new imperial power. These massive structures required forced labor to build, with peasants compelled to abandon their fields during crucial planting or harvest times to drag stones and timber, resulting in food shortages and starvation in surrounding communities. The 13th century saw the rise of professional administrators who brought a coldly efficient approach to exploitation. These weren't warriors with crude methods, but educated men who could calculate exactly how much could be extracted from each manor, village, and household before the population became ungovernable. Cruelty through spreadsheet, if you will. Richard Fitzneal's Dialogue of the Exchequer, written around 1179, provides chilling insight into this bureaucratic mindset. The text dispassionately discusses techniques for maximizing royal revenue extraction, including the use of intimidation and exemplary punishment. Fitzneal advises that when collecting taxes, it's better to make a terrifying example of a few prominent defaulters than to pursue many small cases. Medieval efficiency at its most calculating. Corruption was endemic throughout the system. Sheriffs purchased their positions and then recouped their investment by extracting everything possible from the populace. Court officials took bribes to expedite cases or deliver favorable judgments. Justice wasn't blind. It kept one eye firmly fixed on your purse. The period also witnessed the emergence of bastard feudalism, where relationships increasingly centered on cash payment rather than land grants and personal loyalty. Knights and men-at-arms became effectively mercenaries in the service of whoever could pay them best. These armed retainers, known as livery and maintenance, after the distinctive clothing provided by their lords, could terrorize local populations with near impunity, knowing their powerful masters would protect them from consequences. Perhaps most cruel was the absolute contempt the ruling class showed for those beneath them. Matthew Paris, a 13th century chronicler, records nobles referring to peasants as subhuman and comparing them to animals. This dehumanization enabled exploitation and violence by removing moral constraints. If peasants weren't fully human, why treat them as such? During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when crops failed across Europe, there are accounts of nobles continuing to feast while peasants starved outside their gates. Some lords even increased food exports to profit from rising prices elsewhere, exacerbating local suffering. Economics trumped humanity, a medieval version of disaster capitalism. For all their power, medieval English nobles lived in constant fear of peasant uprising. Their cruelty was both cause and effect of this fear. They oppressed because they feared rebellion, and their oppression made rebellion more likely. This created a self-reinforcing cycle of violence and control that would continue for centuries. As we close this chapter on aristocratic cruelty, remember that every stone castle, every ornate manuscript, every embroidered tapestry from this period represents surplus value extracted from countless nameless peasants who lived and died in conditions we would consider intolerable today. The glories of medieval England were built on foundations of systematic cruelty, with each gilded chalice and stained glass window purchased with the sweat and suffering of the many for the pleasure of the few. The nobility's cruelty wasn't exceptional, it was structural, essential to maintaining a system where less than 2% of the population controlled virtually all wealth and power. And for you, my friend, had you been born into this world, chances are overwhelming that you would have been among the exploited rather than the exploiters. Sweet dreams on that comforting thought. Now that we've examined the elaborate cruelty of England's upper classes, let's sink into the muck and misery of everyday existence for the overwhelming majority of medieval English society, the peasantry. If you thought the nobles had it rough with their drafty castles and occasional political beheadings, prepare yourself for a reality check about the grinding misery that defined peasant life from the moment of birth, assuming you survived it. The medieval English peasant's existence was defined by hardship, so pervasive it's difficult for our modern minds to truly comprehend. Let's start with your living conditions. Your home would be a single-room hovel with walls made of wattle and daub, essentially sticks, covered with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and often animal dung. The roof would be thatched with reeds or straw, providing an inviting habitat for rats, mice, insects, and other vermin that would regularly rain down upon you as you slept, and sleep you would, alongside your entire family and possibly livestock, on a packed earth floor covered with rushes or straw that might be changed seasonally if you were particularly fastidious. By seasonally, I mean perhaps once or twice a year. These rush floors became repositories for all manner of household waste, food scraps, bodily fluids, animal droppings, creating a pungent ecosystem beneath your feet. The medieval expression, sleep tight, likely referred to the ropes supporting straw mattresses that needed regular tightening, not the cloud-like memory foam you're currently lounging on. Your furniture would be minimal, perhaps a table, some stools, and storage chests if you were relatively prosperous. Most peasants ate from wooden trenchers' plates and drank from wooden or horn cups. Pottery and metal utensils were luxury items beyond most budgets. Imagine trying to enjoy your meager gruel while picking splinters from your lips. Bon appetit. Speaking of food, the medieval peasant diet was monotonous to the point of nutritional deficiency. The staple was bread dark, coarse bread made from barley or rye, often stretched with ground peas, beans, or even acorns during lean times. This wasn't the artisanal sourdough you pick up at Whole Foods. This was survival fuel, frequently contaminated with ergot fungus, which caused hallucinations, gangrene, and death. Yes, your daily bread might also be a psychedelic poison. Talk about eating to live dangerously. Protein came mainly from eggs, cheese, and occasionally salt fish or meat, usually pork, since pigs could forage in woodland and required minimal care. Fresh meat was a rarity reserved for feast days, or when an animal had to be slaughtered due to injury or old age. Vegetables came from small garden plots and included onions, garlic, cabbage, and whatever could be foraged from hedgerows and forests, assuming you didn't run afoul of those aforementioned forest laws. The typical peasant consumed between 1,500 and 2,500 calories daily, barely sufficient for the heavy physical labor required, and much of that in the form of ale, which was safer to drink than often contaminated water. Children drank small beer, a weaker brew, from an early age. Yes, you'd essentially be buzzed your entire life, which was perhaps the medieval equivalent of self-care, when reality is unrelentingly harsh. A perpetual slight buzz might be considered medicinal. Your working life would begin around age 5 or 6, initially with simple tasks like scaring birds from fields or collecting kindling, gradually progressing to full agricultural labor by your early teens. For most, education was non-existent. Literacy rates among the peasantry hovered around 10% at best, with most of those being men who needed basic reading skills for trade or craft work. Women's literacy was even rarer, typically limited to those in religious orders or occasionally merchant households. The seasonal rhythm of agricultural labor dictated your existence. Spring meant plowing and planting. Summer brought weeding and haymaking. Autumn was harvest time, and winter involved thrashing grain, repairing tools, and basic survival in the coldest months. Each season brought its own particular hardships: spring's mud and rain, summer's heat and insects, autumn's frantic race to gather crops before they spoiled, winter's cold and darkness. As a serf bound to your lord's manor, you owed not only rent for your meager plot, but also labor service on the domain, the lord's personal farmland. This week work typically required 3 days of labor each week, increased during crucial seasons like harvest. You also owed boon work for special tasks and various payments throughout the year for using the lord's mill to grind grain, for permission to marry, for inheriting your father's holding when he died. The manor court regulated every aspect of your existence. Here, the lord or his steward enforced the intricate web of obligations that bound you to the land. Fines were levied for infractions ranging from brewing ale without permission to allowing your animals to damage crops. These courts also regulated marriages, inheritance, and land transfers, ensuring that the lord's interests were always protected above your own. Perhaps most crushing was the tax burden. Beyond what you owed your immediate lord, there were royal taxes, church tithes, 10% of all produce, and various extraordinary levies for wars, coronations, or royal marriages. The cumulative effect could be devastating, particularly during years of poor harvest or livestock disease. Medieval tax collectors weren't known for their understanding or patience. Payment was expected regardless of your circumstances. Disease was a constant companion in peasant life. Without understanding of germ theory, basic sanitation was primitive at best. Wells were often dug too close to cesspits. Rivers served as both water source and sewage disposal, and personal hygiene was limited by lack of soap and the belief that bathing too frequently was unhealthy. Intestinal parasites were nearly universal. Archaeological examination of medieval latrines reveals eggs from roundworms, whipworms, and tapeworms in virtually every sample. Your teeth would begin rotting in childhood, with no treatment available beyond extraction, without anesthesia when the pain became unbearable. Skin diseases, respiratory infections, and various deficiency disorders were endemic. Women faced additional risks from childbirth, with maternal mortality estimated at 1 to 2% per birth. Given that a typical peasant woman might experience 5 to 10 pregnancies during her reproductive years, the cumulative risk was substantial. By age 30, most peasant women looked twice their age, their bodies broken by constant childbearing, malnutrition, and hard labor. Life expectancy for peasants hovered around 30 years, though this average is skewed by high infant mortality. If you survived childhood, you might reach your 40s or 50s, but you'd be considered elderly by your late 30s. By that point, A lifetime of malnutrition, physical labor, and untreated injuries and illnesses would leave your body thoroughly worn out. Arthritis, hernias, spinal deformities, and chronic respiratory conditions were the common lot of those who reached middle age. The psychological burden of peasant life must not be overlooked. You lived constantly at the edge of subsistence, where a single bad harvest could mean starvation. Your legal status as a serf meant you couldn't leave the manor without permission, couldn't marry without paying a fine, couldn't improve your circumstances through education or changing occupation. The rigid social hierarchy offered essentially no hope of advancement. Your children would inherit your status and likely your exact plot of land, continuing the cycle of grinding poverty. Despite this bleak existence, peasants weren't entirely without moments of joy or community. Village life centered around the parish church, which served not only religious functions, but social ones as well. Feast days and holy days, numbering nearly 1/3 of the year, provided respites from labor, opportunities for communal celebration, and occasionally excess. Ale was brewed, simple games were played, and for brief moments, the harshness of existence might be forgotten. These communal bonds were crucial for survival. When a family faced crisis, illness, injury, or death of a breadwinner, the village often stepped in with support. This wasn't charity as we understand it, but a recognition of mutual dependence. Today, you help your neighbor rebuild after a fire. Tomorrow, they might help you bring in your harvest before a storm. In a world without social safety nets, community was your only insurance policy. But even these supportive networks could collapse under sufficient pressure. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, there are accounts of parents abandoning or even eating their children, of the elderly being left to die so that younger, productive members of the family might survive. Contemporary chronicles describe people resorting to eating dogs, cats, and rats, even disinterring the recently buried for food. When pushed beyond endurance, human solidarity fractures in predictable but horrifying ways. The peasantry wasn't entirely passive in the face of oppression. The 14th century would see the Great Rising of 1381, also called the Peasants' Revolt, when decades of increasing taxation following the Black Death finally triggered open rebellion. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and John Ball, peasants and urban workers briefly threatened the entire social order before being ruthlessly suppressed. The authorities executed not just the leaders, but hundreds of participants, with their bodies displayed publicly as warnings against future unrest. Even in less dramatic ways, peasants practiced everyday resistance, working slowly when under supervision, poaching from the Lord's forests, concealing taxable goods, and maintaining their own customs and practices despite official disapproval. James C. Scott called this weapons of the weak, the subtle ways the powerless resist without directly challenging authority. What's perhaps most remarkable about medieval peasant life isn't the cruelty itself, but how thoroughly normalized it became. The vast majority accepted their lot not because it was just or natural, but because the alternative, challenging the entire social, political, and religious order, seemed impossible. When every institution from the crown to the church preached that the social hierarchy was divinely ordained, questioning your place within it became not just rebellion against earthly authorities, but against God himself. So the next time you romanticize medieval England with its knights and castles, remember that For every bejeweled noble, there were hundreds of peasants like you would have been, living lives of quiet desperation, their bodies broken on the wheel of feudal exploitation, their hopes limited to simple survival, and perhaps a slightly easier life for their children, hopes that would, for most, go unrealized in the cruel calculus of medieval existence. Let's now delve into perhaps the most vividly cruel aspect of medieval England, its justice system. If you've been lulled into a false sense of security by the relatively benign justice systems of modern democracies, prepare yourself for a rude awakening. Medieval English justice wasn't just harsh, it was deliberately, performatively horrific, designed not merely to punish, but to terrorize the population into compliance. The medieval concept of justice differed fundamentally from our own. While today we might view punishment as serving multiple purposes: rehabilitation, deterrence, protection of society, retribution, medieval justice focused almost exclusively on the latter two, with particular emphasis on retribution. Crime was seen not just as an offense against an individual or society, but as a sin against God and the natural order. Punishment, therefore, needed to be proportionately severe to restore that order. Public execution formed the centerpiece of this theatrical approach to justice. Executions weren't hidden away, but conducted as elaborate public spectacles, often attracting thousands of spectators from miles around. Market days were frequently execution days as well, ensuring maximum attendance. These weren't solemn, dignified affairs, but carnivalesque events, with vendors selling refreshments, balladeers composing songs about the condemned, and a festival atmosphere that seems utterly alien to modern sensibilities. Hanging was the most common method of execution, particularly for common criminals. But medieval English hanging wasn't the relatively quick neck-breaking drop developed in the 19th century. Instead, the condemned would slowly strangle to death, a process that could take anywhere from 10 minutes to half an hour. The victim would be led through the streets on a hurdle, a wooden frame, often being pelted with refuse by the crowd before reaching the gallows. After death, the body might remain on display for days or weeks as a warning to others, picked at by birds and gradually decomposing in full public view. Stocks and pillory were used for more minor offenses, exposing offenders to public humiliation and abuse. Positioned in the town square or marketplace, the victim would be unable to defend themselves as the crowd pelted them with mud, rotten food, excrement, and stones. Deaths in the pillory were not uncommon, particularly when the community was especially outraged by the offense. Imagine facing an angry mob with your head and hands locked in place, completely unable to protect yourself or flee. The psychological torture of such complete vulnerability might be as damaging as the physical abuse. Flogging was another common punishment, conducted publicly, with the victim stripped to the waist, or entirely naked in some cases, and tied to a cart that would be drawn through town, stopping at intervals for additional lashes. The whips used often had multiple lashes, sometimes with metal fragments or hooks attached to maximize damage. Recipients frequently died from infection of the wounds, or simply from the trauma and blood loss of the beating itself. Perhaps most disturbing to modern sensibilities was the use of judicial torture, both as punishment and as investigative technique. While England used torture less systematically than continental European countries with their inquisitions, it was still employed, particularly in cases of treason or heresy. The Tower of London housed various torture devices, including the rack for stretching limbs until joints dislocated, the scavenger's daughter, a compression device opposite to the rack, and thumbscrews, fairly self-explanatory, for traitors and those who committed especially heinous crimes. A more elaborate execution awaited: hanging, drawing, and quartering. This process began with hanging until near death, not actual death, followed by disembowelment and castration while still conscious. The victim's entrails would be burned before their eyes, before finally being beheaded and having their body divided into 4 parts for display at various locations around the kingdom. William Wallace of Braveheart fame suffered this fate in 1305, as did countless others whose names history hasn't preserved. Women convicted of treason or petty treason, murdering a husband or master, faced burning at the stake rather than drawing and quartering, supposedly out of modesty concerns about exposing female bodies. How considerate of medieval authorities to be so worried about feminine dignity while literally setting women on fire. The burning wasn't always conducted to ensure quick death. Sometimes a small fire was used to prolong suffering, or the executioner might strangle the victim first as an act of mercy before lighting the pyre. Lesser crimes received lesser, but still brutal punishments. Thieves might have a hand amputated. Forgers might lose the hand that committed the crime. Blasphemers could have their tongues removed. Adulterers might be stripped naked and paraded through town. Physical mutilation served not only as punishment, but as permanent marking of criminals, a medieval version of a criminal record written on the body itself. The legal basis for these tortures was often dubious. Official policy stated that torture could only be used with royal warrant, but in practice, local authorities frequently employed it without such authorization. Records from the Tower note, matter-of-factly, how many inches victims were stretched on the rack, as if measuring fabric rather than the limits of human endurance. Prisons themselves were not places of rehabilitation or even primarily punishment in the medieval period, but mainly served to hold accused persons awaiting trial or convicted persons awaiting execution. Conditions were appalling beyond modern comprehension. Prisoners were generally responsible for their own upkeep, having to pay for food, bedding, and even the chains that bound them. Those without money or outside support might starve to death before their cases were heard. Disease was rampant in these facilities, with typhus, jail fever, so common that it regularly infected not just prisoners, but judges and lawyers during court sessions. The infamous Black Assize of Oxford in 1577 saw over 300 people, including the chief baron of the Exchequer, die from disease contracted during court proceedings. Medieval prisons were so notoriously lethal that receiving a prison sentence of significant length was effectively a death sentence by another name. The medieval justice system's cruelty extended beyond physical punishment to encompass fundamental procedural injustice. Until the late medieval period, defendants had no right to counsel, often faced their accusers without knowing the specific charges beforehand, and could be convicted on remarkably flimsy evidence. Women, minorities, and the poor were at particular disadvantage in this system, lacking both the social connections and financial resources needed to navigate it successfully. Corruption permeated every level of the process. Sheriffs, judges, and other officials routinely accepted bribes to influence outcomes. Jurors could be threatened or bought. Even the king's justice was for sale, with wealthy defendants able to purchase pardons or reduced sentences. The 13th century legal writer Bracton noted that justice had become a venal commodity, available to the highest bidder rather than distributed according to guilt or innocence. Perhaps most shocking to modern sensibilities was the use of trial by ordeal, which persisted in various forms until formally prohibited by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. The ordeal of water involved binding the accused and lowering them into a body of water. Floating indicated guilt, rejected by the pure water, while sinking suggested innocence, accepted by the water. Yes, the proof of your innocence was potentially drowning, though presumably you'd be pulled out before death. Hopefully, the ordeal of hot iron required the accused to carry a heated iron bar for a specified distance. Afterward, their hand would be bandaged and examined 3 days later. A clean wound indicated innocence, while infection suggested guilt. Of course, virtually all such wounds would become infected, given medieval medical knowledge, effectively making this a test of how quickly your particular wound festered rather than any measure of culpability. Despite the Fourth Lateran Council's prohibition, ordeal-like procedures continued in modified forms. Most notorious was the swimming of witches, which persisted well into the 17th century. The accused would be stripped, bound in a specific position, right thumb to left toe, left thumb to right toe, and thrown into water. Floating indicated guilt, sinking innocence. The similarity to the earlier ordeal of water is obvious, despite the reversal of the outcome's meaning. Children were not exempt from this cruel system. The age of criminal responsibility was 7 years, and children as young as 7 were indeed hanged for serious crimes. In 1708, the Old Bailey records show a 7-year-old boy was executed for stealing a metal cup, while children under 14 were supposed to be judged on whether they understood the difference between right and wrong before being held fully accountable. In practice, this protection was inconsistently applied at best. The medieval period also saw the formal establishment of sanctuary law, whereby fugitives could claim temporary refuge in churches. While seemingly merciful, this system had its own cruelties. Those claiming sanctuary had 40 days to either surrender to authorities or confess their crimes and accept permanent exile from England. This abjuration of the realm meant leaving with only the clothes on your back, walking barefoot to a designated port, and taking the first available ship, regardless of destination. Many died during these journeys or faced slavery or execution in foreign lands where they had no protection or resources. Even death did not necessarily end one's juridical troubles. Suicide was considered both crime and sin, leading to the practice of burying at the crossroads with a stake through the heart, a punishment inflicted on a corpse, but meant to terrorize the living. The estates of suicides were forfeit to the crown, potentially leaving their families destitute. Records show inquests, sometimes mercifully ruling obvious suicides as accidents to spare families this additional suffering, perhaps one of the few merciful aspects of the entire system. The cruelty of medieval English justice wasn't merely excessive by modern standards, it was deliberately so. Public punishment served as governance through terror, a means of controlling a largely illiterate population through visceral, unforgettable spectacle. Each hanging, each flogging, each mutilation sent a clear message about the consequences of challenging authority or disrupting the social order. Perhaps the most telling aspect of this system is that despite its extreme brutality, or perhaps because of it, crime remained endemic throughout the medieval period. Highway robbery, burglary, theft, and violence persisted at high levels despite the terminal consequences if caught. This suggests either the profound desperation of those who turned to crime despite knowing the potential punishment, or their reasonable calculation that the likelihood of capture and conviction was low enough to risk it. Either way, the medieval justice system stands as perhaps the most explicitly, intentionally cruel aspect of English society in this period, a system designed not to correct or rehabilitate, but to create such overwhelming fear that obedience seemed the only rational choice. The fact that it largely failed even in this objective only underscores the futility of cruelty as a cornerstone of social policy. Unfortunately, this lesson would take centuries more to learn. Let's illuminate the particular darkness of religious persecution. While medieval people generally viewed faith as the central organizing principle of existence, providing meaning and solace amid hardship, religion also served as an exceptionally efficient mechanism for inflicting systematic cruelty on those who deviated from orthodox beliefs or belonged to minority faiths. The church in medieval England wasn't just a spiritual institution, but a political and economic powerhouse, controlling approximately 1/3 of the land, operating its own courts, and exerting enormous influence over every aspect of life. This concentration of power created perfect conditions for abuse, particularly against those branded as heretics, apostates, or simply other. Heresy, broadly defined as holding religious beliefs contrary to church doctrine, became increasingly persecuted from the 12th century onward. Early medieval England was relatively tolerant of theological diversity, but as church power consolidated, tolerance diminished proportionally. The establishment of the medieval Inquisition in the 1230s, though primarily focused on continental Europe, influenced English approaches to religious deviance as well. Take the Lollards, followers of John Wycliffe, who advocated for an English Bible and challenged church authority in the late 14th century. After initially enjoying some protection from powerful nobles, the Lollards faced increasing persecution following the 1401 Statute of Heresy, which authorized burning heretics alive. William Sawtry earned the dubious distinction of becoming the first person executed under the statute, burned at Smithfield in 1401 for denying transubstantiation and refusing to worship the cross. The burning of heretics wasn't just about eliminating religious dissent, but about spectacularly demonstrating the consequences of challenging church authority. Condemned heretics would be led to the execution site wearing a white shirt covered with painted devils and flames, a visual preview of their eternal fate. The stake was often elevated so the crowd could better witness the victim's suffering, and green wood might be used to slow the burning and prolong agony. Sometimes executioners tied bags of gunpowder around the victim's neck as an act of mercy, providing a quicker death when the flames reached them, assuming the executioner was feeling merciful that day. While male heretics typically faced burning, women accused of heresy sometimes encountered gendered forms of torture during investigation. Female suspects were more likely to be subjected to sleep deprivation, starvation, and psychological manipulation rather than direct physical torture. which was considered less appropriate for the weaker sex. How thoughtful of medieval inquisitors to respect gender norms while extracting false confessions. The persecution of supposed witches represents another dark chapter in medieval English religious cruelty, though mass witch hunts were more a feature of the later medieval and early modern periods. Early and high medieval approaches to witchcraft were relatively restrained compared to later excesses, with the Church initially treating supposed magical practices as superstition rather than diabolical conspiracy. This began changing in the later medieval period as theological opinions shifted toward viewing witchcraft as explicit devil worship rather than misguided folk practice. The 1401 Act against heresy encompassed witchcraft as well, and by the late 15th century, the groundwork was laid for the more extensive witch persecutions that would follow in subsequent centuries. Accusations of witchcraft disproportionately targeted women, particularly older, single women whose independence or knowledge of herbal medicine made them socially suspect. The interrogation of accused witches involved procedures designed to extract confessions through a combination of physical and psychological torture, including pricking, stabbing the skin with needles to find supposedly insensitive spots indicating a witch's mark, sleep deprivation, and forced standing for extended periods. The swimming test I mentioned earlier found particular application in witch trials. The accused would be bound and lowered into water. Floating supposedly indicated guilt, rejected by the pure element, while sinking suggested innocence, though possibly resulting in drowning. It was literally a lose-lose situation: survive and face execution, or drown while proving your innocence. Medieval justice, at its most logically circular, perhaps the most sustained and systematic religious persecution in medieval England, targeted the Jewish community. Jews first arrived in England following the Norman conquest, initially serving a specific economic role as moneylenders, since church law prohibited Christians from charging interest. This designated economic function immediately placed Jews in an adversarial relationship with debtors, while simultaneously making them valuable to the crown, which taxed their profits heavily. The situation deteriorated sharply during the 12th century as religious fervor increased, particularly around the Crusades. The coronation of Richard I in 1189 triggered a massacre of London's Jewish population when rumors spread that the king had ordered their elimination. Similar violence erupted in York in 1190, culminating in the infamous incident at Clifford's Tower, where approximately 150 Jews committed mass suicide rather than face the mob or forced conversion. These weren't isolated incidents, but part of a pattern of increasing persecution. Jews were required to wear identifying badges, typically yellow, from 1218 onward, centuries before Nazi Germany implemented similar requirements. They faced restrictions on where they could live, what occupations they could practice, and even how they could interact with Christians. Blood libel accusations, the false claim that Jews murdered Christian children for ritual purposes, became increasingly common, leading to mob violence and judicial murders. The ritual murder accusation against the Jews of Lincoln in 1255 provides a particularly disturbing example. When the body of an 8-year-old boy named Hugh was discovered, local Jews were accused of ritual murder. Under torture, a Jewish man named Koppen confessed to the crime and implicated others. nearly 100 Jews were arrested, with 19 executed, and Koppen himself tied to a horse's tail, dragged through the streets, and then hanged. The boy, meanwhile, became venerated as Little Saint Hugh of Lincoln, with a shrine that attracted pilgrims for centuries afterward. Religious devotion, built literally on the corpses of the falsely accused. Edward I's 1290 Edict of Expulsion marked the culmination of this persecution, forcing all Jews to leave England on pain of death. Approximately 3,000 Jews were expelled, many dying during their journey as they faced robbery, violence, and treachery from ship captains who took their money and then abandoned or murdered them. The expulsion was so thorough that Jews would not legally return to England until the 1650s, nearly 4 centuries later. Even Christians who followed church doctrine weren't immune from religious cruelty. If they violated social norms or challenged authority, the church's penitential system could impose harsh physical and psychological burdens. Public penance for serious sins might require the penitent to stand barefoot outside the church for specified periods, wearing only a shirt regardless of weather conditions, or to undertake grueling pilgrimages that could take months or years to complete. Excommunication, the church's ultimate sanction, extended far beyond spiritual consequences. An excommunicated person became a social pariah who couldn't participate in legal proceedings, conduct business, or receive assistance from others without risking similar punishment. In a society where community was essential for survival, this amounted to a living death. Medieval excommunication wasn't just about your relationship with God, but your very existence within human society. Church courts held jurisdiction over moral offenses, including sexual transgressions, and their punishments could be severe. Women accused of adultery or prostitution might be sentenced to public humiliation rituals like the carrying of white sticks through town or wearing specific identifying clothing. Men convicted of sexual offenses typically faced fines rather than public shame. One of many gendered disparities in medieval justice, religious institutions themselves could be sites of cruelty rather than comfort. Monasteries and convents, while providing crucial social services, including education and healthcare, sometimes imposed brutal discipline on their members. Flagellation became increasingly common as a devotional practice from the 13th century onward, with some religious orders requiring regular self-whipping as spiritual discipline. The more extreme practitioners might use whips embedded with metal or bone fragments, causing wounds that could become infected and even prove fatal. Children given to religious houses as oblates offerings had no choice in their vocation and faced harsh discipline if they resisted their imposed calling. Chronicles record cases of young novices attempting escape only to be recaptured and severely punished through isolation, beating, or food deprivation. Their religious vows were considered binding regardless of whether they had genuinely consented or understood their implications. The church's approach to sexuality created particular forms of psychological cruelty. Natural sexual desires were demonized as sinful temptation, with masturbation sometimes categorized alongside serious sins like murder in penitential manuals. This instilled profound shame and anxiety, particularly in adolescents, taught that their normal developmental urges were pathways to damnation. The emphasis on confession meant regularly verbalizing these sins to parish priests, creating cycles of shame, confession, temporary relief, and renewed shame that could last a lifetime. Even death offered no escape from religious control and potential cruelty. Church doctrine on purgatory taught that most souls would spend time there before reaching heaven, suffering purifying but painful torments for their earthly sins. This concept was vividly depicted in church art, with souls portrayed in flames or enduring various tortures. For medieval people who took these ideas literally, the prospect of such suffering, potentially lasting thousands of years, created immense anxiety that could only be relieved through purchasing indulgences, funding masses for the dead, or other financial contributions to the church. Those denied proper Christian burial faced particular horror in the medieval imagination. Suicides, excommunicates, and unbaptized infants were buried in unconsecrated ground, often at crossroads or other liminal spaces. This wasn't just a practical exclusion, but believed to condemn their souls to eternal restlessness or torment. Parents of stillborn infants faced the additional anguish of believing their children would never reach heaven due to dying unbaptized, a theological cruelty difficult to justify even by medieval standards. Religious persecution in medieval England wasn't just about enforcing doctrinal conformity, but about maintaining social control through fear. By defining salvation as contingent on obedience to ecclesiastical authority and portraying the consequences of disobedience in the most terrifying possible terms, both earthly torture and eternal damnation, the Church created a system where questioning either religious dogma or the existing social order became almost unthinkable for most people. The truly insidious aspect of religious cruelty was how it became self-perpetuating, with victims often becoming the most enthusiastic enforcers once they had themselves been thoroughly indoctrinated. Those most terrified of hell became the most determined to punish heresy in others, creating cycles of fear-driven violence that could sweep through entire communities. When eternal salvation is at stake, even the most extreme measures can seem justified. As we close this chapter on religious persecution, remember that these weren't simply the excesses of a few fanatical individuals, but systematic policies endorsed by the highest religious and secular authorities. The cruelty wasn't accidental, but purposeful, designed to terrorize populations into conformity and eliminate threats to established power. Perhaps most disturbing is how effectively religious language and imagery was used to sanctify what were, at their core, exercises in raw power and control. While human cruelty certainly defined much of medieval England's character, nature itself proved an equally merciless antagonist. The medieval period witnessed environmental and biological calamities of such devastating scale that they fundamentally reshaped English society. Chief among these was the notorious Black Death, a pandemic so catastrophic it deserves its own chapter in our exploration of medieval cruelty. The Black Death arrived on English shores in June 1348, likely via a merchant ship docking at Weymouth in Dorset. What began as isolated cases in port towns soon exploded into a nationwide catastrophe, sweeping across England with terrifying speed and efficiency. By the time the first wave subsided in 1350, between 40 to 60% of England's population lay dead. Somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million people. Try to comprehend that scale of loss. Nearly half the people you know Gone within 24 months, the disease itself manifested with particularly cruel symptoms. The most common form, bubonic plague, produced painful swellings, buboes, in the lymph nodes, particularly in the neck, armpit, and groin, sometimes growing as large as apples. These buboes would eventually rupture, releasing foul-smelling pus. Victims experienced extreme fever, vomiting, headaches, and often suffered from painful muscle cramps. Death typically came within 2 to 7 days of first symptoms. More terrifying still was pneumonic plague, which attacked the lungs and spread directly from person to person through coughing and breathing. This variant proved even more lethal, often killing within 24 hours of symptom onset. The septicemic form, which entered the bloodstream directly, could kill so quickly that victims sometimes died before buboes even formed, with skin turning black from internal bleeding, hence the Black Death. Medieval medicine, with its humoral theories and limited understanding of contagion, stood helpless before this onslaught. Doctors prescribed remedies ranging from ineffective to actively harmful: bloodletting, herbal concoctions, applying live toads to buboes, or inhaling aromatic substances. Some physicians refused to visit plague victims entirely, while others wore bizarre protective gear, including bird-like masks filled with herbs and spices, believing they would filter bad air. Perhaps most cruel was the social response to the plague. As panic spread, so did the search for scapegoats. Jewish communities faced renewed persecution, accused of poisoning wells or spreading disease through magical means. In continental Europe, this led to massacres of entire Jewish populations. While England had already expelled its Jewish population in 1290, the plague, nevertheless, intensified anti-Semitic sentiment that would persist for centuries. Families abandoned infected relatives, leaving them to die alone. Villages refused entry to travelers. The dead accumulated faster than they could be buried, with mass graves becoming necessary in urban areas. In London, excavations have revealed plague pits containing layers upon layers of bodies, sometimes with minimal soil between them, grim testimony to the overwhelming scale of mortality. Religious authorities interpreted the plague as divine punishment for sin, leading to the emergence of flagellant movements, groups of penitents who publicly whipped themselves bloody, believing their self-punishment might appease God's wrath. More practically, many clergy refused to administer last rites to plague victims out of fear of infection, meaning countless people died without what they believed was necessary for salvation. The plague's aftermath generated its own forms of cruelty. Labor shortages created by mass death should have improved conditions for surviving peasants, but the ruling class responded with the Statute of Laborers in 1351, which attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict worker mobility, essentially trying to legislate away the new economic reality. This suppression of natural wage increases represented a deliberate policy to maintain aristocratic wealth at the expense of working people's improved prospects. But the Black Death wasn't an isolated incident. England experienced recurring plague outbreaks approximately every decade throughout the late medieval period, with particularly severe episodes in 1361 and 1362. The Children's Plague, which disproportionately affected young people who had survived or been born after the initial outbreak, 1374, 1375, 1400, and 1420. Each new wave reinforced the psychological trauma of the original pandemic, creating a society perpetually braced for return of the great mortality. Beyond plague, medieval England faced numerous other biological and environmental catastrophes. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 resulted from unprecedented rainfall and crop failures across northern Europe. Monastic chronicles describe people resorting to eating dogs, cats, rats, and even rumors of cannibalism as starvation took hold. One contemporary account reports that the dead lay unburied alongside roads because the living lacked strength to dig graves. Modern estimates suggest mortality rates between 10 and 25% in affected regions. The famine's effects lingered for years afterward. Children born during or shortly after experienced stunted growth and increased vulnerability to disease, evident in skeletal remains from the period. Malnutrition compromised immune systems, making survivors more susceptible to the tuberculosis, dysentery, and influenza that regularly swept through medieval populations. England's climate itself seemed to turn cruel during the medieval period. The relatively warm medieval climate optimum, approximately 950 to 1250 CE, gave way to the beginning of the Little Ice Age around 1300. Average temperatures declined by 1 to 2 degrees Celsius, a seemingly small change with devastating agricultural consequences. Growing seasons shortened, crop yields declined, and marginal upland areas previously suitable for farming became unsustainable. Weather extremes became more common, with records describing summer flooding, unexpected frosts, and winter storms of unusual severity. The Thames froze solid enough to support frost fairs multiple times during the later medieval period. Such unpredictable conditions played havoc with agricultural planning, contributing to recurring food shortages even in years without outright famine. Livestock diseases added another layer of suffering. The Great Cattle Plague of 1319 to 1320 killed approximately 62% of England's cattle, devastating both food supplies and the availability of draft animals for plowing. Sheep murrain, likely anthrax, repeatedly struck flocks throughout the 14th century, undermining wool production, the backbone of medieval England's economy. When combined with crop failures, these animal epidemics created perfect storms of agricultural collapse. Waterborne illnesses thrived in medieval England's unsanitary conditions. Dysentery, known colloquially as the bloody flux, was endemic, causing severe diarrhea that rapidly led to fatal dehydration, particularly in children and the elderly. Wells and streams were frequently contaminated with human and animal waste, while urban centers like London had streets literally flowing with sewage during rainfall. Malaria, then called ague or marsh fever, was common in England's extensive wetland areas, particularly the fens of East Anglia and the Somerset levels. While rarely directly fatal, malaria's recurring fevers weakened victims, making them more susceptible to other diseases and reducing their working capacity, a serious issue in a society where physical labor dominated most occupations. Tuberculosis, consumption, maintained a constant presence, its slow wasting particularly cruel as victims gradually weakened over months or years. Skeletal evidence shows tubercular lesions in 40 to 60% of adult remains from some medieval cemeteries, suggesting extremely high infection rates. The disease's slow progression allowed it to spread widely before killing its host, creating efficient transmission patterns throughout communities. Leprosy represents a uniquely cruel disease of medieval England, not just for its physical effects, but for the social response it generated. While modern leprosy, Hansen's disease, is difficult to transmit and treatable with antibiotics, medieval communities feared it as highly contagious. Diagnosed individuals underwent a literal living funeral ceremony, declared legally dead, their property redistributed, and banished to isolated leper houses, leprosaria. Over 300 leprosaria existed in medieval England, housing those excluded from normal society. Lepers were required to wear distinctive clothing, carry a bell to warn others of their approach, and forbidden from touching public objects or entering churches and marketplaces. The disease itself caused progressive disfigurement, nerve damage, and disability, a physical suffering compounded by complete social isolation. Infant and childhood mortality presents perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of medieval England's natural cruelty. Approximately 30% of children died before age 5, with the first year of life particularly dangerous. Childbirth itself claimed roughly 1 to 2% of mothers per birth, a seemingly small percentage, until you consider that a typical woman might experience 5 to 10 pregnancies during her reproductive years, with cumulative maternal mortality ranging from 5 to 20%. Dental disease inflicted constant pain on medieval populations. Without effective oral hygiene or dental care, tooth decay and abscesses were universal experiences. Teeth were extracted without anesthesia when pain became unbearable, but many people lived with chronic dental pain for years or decades. Skeletal evidence shows extensive periodontal disease, with many adults losing most or all teeth by middle age, compromising nutrition and quality of life. Parasitic infections added another layer of misery. Intestinal worms, including roundworm, whipworm, and tapeworm, infected virtually everyone, competing for nutrients and causing various digestive problems. External parasites like lice, fleas, and bedbugs were equally ubiquitous, causing skin irritation and transmitting diseases, including typhus and plague. Natural disasters struck with particular cruelty, given medieval England's limited capacity for response or recovery. The Great Storm of 1362, known as the Groat Wind or St. Maury's Wind, destroyed buildings across southern England, damaged churches, and caused widespread flooding when it struck on January 15th. Lacking weather forecasting, communities had no warning before such catastrophes, flooding regularly devastated low-lying areas, particularly around river estuaries and coastal regions. The Thames Valley experienced major floods in 1236, 1288, and 1338, while East Anglia suffered repeated inundations that sometimes permanently altered coastlines. The 1287 to 1288 floods along England's south coast destroyed the port town of Old Winchelsea entirely, forcing the construction of New Winchelsea at a different location. Fire presented a constant threat to medieval communities built primarily of wood and thatch. London experienced major conflagrations in 1135 and 1212, the latter reportedly killing as many as 3,000 people. Without organized firefighting capabilities, blazes often spread unchecked until they ran out of fuel or were stopped by natural barriers like rivers. What made natural disasters and diseases particularly cruel in medieval England wasn't just their direct effects, but the prevailing interpretations of their causes. People understood these calamities not as random misfortunes or natural phenomena, but as divine judgment, God's punishment for sin. This added psychological torture to physical suffering, as victims wondered what they had done to deserve such divine wrath. The cruel irony is that many medieval responses to natural disasters actually worsened conditions. Prayer processions during plague outbreaks gathered large groups together, facilitating disease transmission. Fasting during food shortages further weakened already malnourished bodies. The persecution of supposed witches or other scapegoats diverted energy from practical solutions while compounding human suffering. By the late medieval period, this succession of catastrophes, plague, famine, livestock disease, extreme weather, had fundamentally altered England's relationship with nature and mortality. The ubiquity of sudden death found expression in the artistic motif of the danse macabre, or dance of death, depicting people from all social classes being led away by personified death, a reminder of mortality's democratic nature in a deeply stratified society. Nature's cruelty proved the great equalizer in medieval England. While wealth and status provided some buffer against hardship, no one from king to peasant was truly safe from plague, famine, or natural disaster. Perhaps that's what made these calamities particularly terrifying in a society obsessed with hierarchy and order. They revealed the fundamental vulnerability of all human life, regardless of earthly status or power. Treatment or torture. In medieval England, the line between the two wasn't just blurry, it was practically non-existent. So tonight, as you settle deeper into your impossibly comfortable modern mattress, let's explore the medical horrors your ancestors endured in the name of healing. Medieval medicine operated at the precarious intersection of four competing worldviews: Galenic humoral theory, imported from ancient Greece, Christian religious doctrine, folk remedies passed down through generations, and a dash of outright superstition. This fascinating but frequently lethal cocktail meant that if illness didn't kill you, the cure just might. The foundational principle of medieval medicine was the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These substances supposedly governed all bodily functions and temperaments. When they fell out of balance, illness followed. The preferred solution: bloodletting. Yes, in a time when nutrition was already questionable and hygiene practically non-existent, the medically sanctioned response to weakness was often to drain away more of your precious bodily fluids. Imagine you're a moderately prosperous merchant in 14th century London. You've developed a nagging cough and fever. The local barber surgeon arrives at your home. Medical practitioners came in various forms, from university-educated physicians who rarely touched patients to practical surgeons who doubled as barbers. He examines your urine in a special flask held up to the light, a practice called uroscopy. After careful consideration of its color, smell, and even taste, yes, tasting urine was a diagnostic technique. He declares your blood is overheated and must be reduced. The procedure commences. Leeches might be applied to your skin, their anticoagulant saliva ensuring a steady flow of blood. Alternatively, the barber surgeon might perform phlebotomy, opening a vein with a lancet. The goal wasn't a small blood sample like modern testing. They'd drain pints of your blood into a bowl, sometimes until you lost consciousness. But wait, you might protest. Wouldn't draining blood from someone already weakened by illness make them worse? Congratulations, you've just demonstrated more medical common sense than centuries of medieval practitioners. Bloodletting continued as standard practice well into the 19th century, killing untold thousands, including quite possibly King Charles II and George Washington. If bloodletting wasn't deemed appropriate, perhaps trepanation would be. This involved drilling or scraping a hole into your skull to release pressure or allow evil spirits to escape. Remarkably, archaeological evidence shows some patients survived this procedure's skulls have been found with healing around the drill sites. We can only imagine how many weren't so fortunate. Surgical procedures were performed with minimal understanding of anatomy, no concept of germ theory, and crucially, no anesthesia beyond alcohol, opium, or mandragora, a relative of deadly nightshade. For major operations like amputations, patients were sometimes rendered unconscious by a sharp blow to the head, a practice that came with its own considerable risks. Surgeons did understand the importance of speed, however. The most skilled medieval amputators could remove a limb in under a minute, necessary when your patient is fully conscious and in excruciating pain. Afterward, wounds might be cauterized with red-hot iron, sealed with boiling oil, or in later periods, stitched with catgut sutures made from animal intestines, despite the name. Then there were the remedies themselves. Medieval medicine cabinets contained everything from the sensible to the stomach-turning. Some herbal treatments, like willow bark, containing salicylic acid, similar to aspirin for pain or garlic for infections, had genuine medicinal properties. Others, like powdered Egyptian mummy for internal bleeding or crushed pearls for heart ailments, were useless but relatively harmless. Then came truly revolting remedies, consuming powdered human skull for epilepsy, applying warm animal dung to wounds, drinking urine to treat various ailments. One 15th century remedy for cataracts advised washing the eyes with a mixture of sugar, tutty zinc oxide, and wait for it, powdered human feces. Did you know that some medieval English doctors prescribed theriac, or Venice treacle, as a universal antidote? This mixture contained up to 64 ingredients, including opium, herbs, spices, and rather alarmingly, powdered viper flesh. Preparation took months, and the compound was aged for years before use, making it extraordinarily expensive. Kings and wealthy nobles kept theriac on hand, believing it protected against everything from poison to plague. While some ingredients may have had mild medicinal properties, the mixture primarily offered false security at extravagant cost. For the wealthy, complex astrological calculations often determined treatment timing. Physicians might refuse to perform procedures when certain planets were aligned unfavorably. Medical textbooks included detailed zodiacal charts indicating which body parts could be safely treated under which astrological signs, all while the patient continued suffering. Religion and medicine were thoroughly intertwined. Illness was frequently viewed as divine punishment for sin, and prayer was considered as essential as any physical remedy. Saints were associated with specific ailments. Saint Apollonia for toothaches, Saint Roch for plague. Pilgrims would travel hundreds of miles to cathedrals housing holy relics, believing proximity to a saint's finger bone or scrap of clothing might cure their afflictions. Hospitals existed, but they weren't places of healing as we understand them today. Medieval hospitals were primarily religious institutions, focused more on providing spiritual comfort to the dying than medical treatment. The sick were housed together regardless of condition, meaning contagious diseases spread rapidly. Hospitals emphasized confession and last rites over medical intervention, acting more as hospices or almshouses than treatment centers. Women played a significant but often overlooked role in medieval healthcare. While largely excluded from university education, women served as midwives, herbalists, and lay healers in their communities. Their practical knowledge of herbal remedies, passed down through generations, often provided more effective treatment than the theoretical approaches of university-trained physicians. However, this knowledge could be dangerous to possess. Too much success at healing might brand a woman as a witch, particularly after the 14th century, when witch hunts intensified. The Black Death brought new horrors to medical practice, as physicians failed spectacularly to address the plague. Desperate remedies proliferated. People were advised to sit in sewers to counter the bad air believed to spread disease. Others were told to carry pouches of aromatic herbs or to consume crushed emeralds if they could afford them. Plague doctors eventually adopted their iconic beaked masks, stuffed with herbs to filter the air, an eerily prescient precursor to modern protective equipment, though based on flawed understanding. Perhaps most cruelly, mental illness received particularly barbaric treatment. Those with psychiatric conditions were often believed to be possessed by demons, subjected to exorcisms, or simply chained and imprisoned. By the late medieval period, some towns established bedlam hospitals specifically for the mentally ill, where patients endured horrific conditions and were sometimes displayed to paying visitors for entertainment. The tragedy of medieval medicine lies in how it combined genuine compassion with profound ignorance. Practitioners genuinely wanted to heal, but lacked the fundamental understanding to do so effectively. While we might shudder at their methods today, they were operating with the best knowledge available to them at the time. The battlefields of medieval England were laboratories of cruelty, where each technological advancement was measured not just in territory gained, but in ever more efficient ways to destroy human bodies. As you lie there in the darkness, let's march through the evolution of engineered brutality, a procession of increasingly sophisticated methods designed with one purpose: to make killing more effective. Warfare in early medieval England, the Anglo-Saxon period following the Roman withdrawal, was relatively straightforward. Shield walls of infantry, armed with spears, formed the backbone of armies. These battles were brutal, but somewhat democratic affairs. Death came equally to all who faced the enemy line. The Norman conquest of 1066 changed everything, introducing continental military technology and, crucially, a new military elite, heavily armored mounted knights who dominated battlefields and society alike. The knight was essentially a medieval tank, expensively equipped, extensively trained, and nearly invulnerable to ordinary soldiers. Encased in mail armor, interlocking metal rings, and later plate armor, mounted on massive war horses specially bred for strength, and wielding lances that could punch through shields, knights revolutionized warfare, but they also crystallized its cruelty. No longer was war primarily fought between relatively equal combatants. Now, it featured an armored aristocracy almost immune to the weapons of common soldiers. Remember that damp wool tunic mentioned way back in our discussion of peasant clothing. Imagine facing a charging knight while wearing nothing more protective than that, armed with perhaps a farming implement or simple spear. Your odds of survival approached zero. Yet this mismatch was precisely the point. Knights were the ultimate expression of the feudal system's inequality, designed specifically to ensure that the nobility remained militarily dominant over the masses they ruled. The weapons themselves tell a story of deliberate brutality. Consider the poleaxe, a knight's weapon for dismounted combat. One end featured a hammerhead for denting armor, opposite a curved spike for puncturing it. The top bore an additional spike for thrusting, and some versions included a hook for pulling riders from horses. Every inch of this weapon was engineered specifically to maim and kill armored men in the most efficient manner possible. Archers represented another dimension of warfare's cruelty. The English longbow, famous for its decisive role at battles like Crécy, 1346, and Agincourt, 1415, could launch arrows over 200 yards with enough force to penetrate armor. At Agincourt, approximately 6,000 English archers fired as many as 75,000 arrows per minute at the advancing French. The effect wasn't just lethal, it was industrial slaughter, transforming battlefield death from individual combat to mass production. Did you know that English law actually required all able-bodied men to practice archery regularly? The Assize of Arms of 1252 mandated that all free men possess and train with weapons according to their wealth, with archery practice specifically required after church services on Sundays. Local festivals often included archery competitions with mandatory participation. This created a massive pool of trained archers that could be conscripted for war, essentially weaponizing the entire male population. Medieval siege warfare added another dimension of calculated cruelty. When armies couldn't defeat each other in open battle, they resorted to besieging castles and walled cities. The objective was simple: starve the defenders into submission. Sieges could last months or even years, with civilians inside the walls suffering disease and starvation, while armies systematically destroyed surrounding farmland to prevent any relief. The development of siege engines brought new horrors. Trebuchets could launch projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds to devastating effect. While primarily used against fortifications, they were also psychological weapons. Besiegers sometimes catapulted diseased corpses over walls to spread illness, or the severed heads of captured messengers and allies to demoralize defenders. During Edward I's siege of Stirling Castle in 1304, his trebuchet Warwolf was so terrifying that the Scottish garrison tried to surrender when they saw it being assembled. Edward refused their surrender, insisting on firing the weapon first to demonstrate its power. For those who survived battles, treatment of prisoners varied wildly depending on social status. Captured nobility could expect ransom rather than execution. Warfare was, after all, partly a business venture for medieval commanders. Knights could be worth enormous sums. King John of France, captured at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, was ransomed for an astronomical 3 million gold crowns, approximately twice the annual revenue of the English crown. Common soldiers received no such consideration. They were typically killed outright unless they possessed valuable skills. The lucky ones might be conscripted into their captors' forces. The unlucky faced torture, mutilation, or execution. After the Battle of Agincourt, Henry V ordered the massacre of French prisoners when a French counterattack seemed imminent, a decision considered shocking even by the standards of the time, but one that illuminates the fundamentally utilitarian approach to human life that characterized medieval warfare, the 100 Years' War, which actually lasted 116 years, from 1337 to 1453, between England and France, saw warfare's cruelty expand beyond the battlefield through the chevauchée, systematic campaigns of destruction through enemy territory. English armies would deliberately avoid French military forces, instead focusing on burning crops, destroying villages, and terrorizing civilians. This was not collateral damage, but deliberate strategy designed to undermine the French economy and political stability. Edward the Black Prince, son of Edward III, conducted particularly devastating chevauchées through France in the 1350s. His forces destroyed everything in a path, sometimes 50 miles wide, leaving smoking ruins and starving peasants in their wake. Chronicles record villages and towns reduced to ash, vineyards uprooted, and civilians massacred. This wasn't mindless destruction. It was calculated economic warfare designed to deprive the French crown of tax revenue and provoke political instability. Castle design itself embodied warfare's increasingly sophisticated cruelty. Early medieval castles were primarily defensive structures, but by the 13th and 14th centuries, they incorporated numerous offensive elements. Arrow loops were carefully positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Murder holes, openings in ceilings, allowed defenders to pour boiling water, hot sand, or burning oil onto attackers. Gatehouses became elaborate death traps with multiple portcullises, allowing attackers to be trapped between gates and eliminated at leisure. The evolution of armor-paralleled weapons development in a lethal arms race. Mail armor, effective against slashing attacks, proved vulnerable to the stabbing power of arrows and spears. This led to the development of plate armor, which in turn drove innovations in weapons designed specifically to defeat it. Warhammers to dent and crush, spike-tipped maces to puncture, and halberds to drag knights from horseback. By the late medieval period, specialized weapons emerged for the gruesome task of finishing off wounded, armored opponents. The Misericord Mercy Giver was a thin-bladed dagger specifically designed to penetrate the gaps in plate armor slipped through eye slits or under the armpit into the heart. Its name reflected its paradoxical purpose, delivering a quick death to wounded knights who otherwise might suffer for hours, unable to rise or remove their heavy armor. Naval warfare added its own distinctive cruelties. English longships were designed not primarily for ship-to-ship combat, but for transporting troops and conducting rapid coastal raids. Viking influence remained strong in medieval naval tactics, with ships serving as mobile platforms for what were essentially seaborne infantry. Battles at sea often involved grappling enemy vessels and boarding them for hand-to-hand combat. Ships were frequently fitted with wooden castles at bow and stern, from which archers could rain arrows on enemy decks. The social impact of this engineered brutality extended far beyond the battlefield. England's martial culture glorified violence as the natural expression of nobility. Young aristocrats trained from childhood in the use of weapons, participating in tournaments that, despite occasional royal prohibitions, remained bloody affairs where participants were regularly maimed or killed. These were not mere sporting events, but essential preparation for warfare, desensitizing future knights to violence and teaching them to find honor in inflicting suffering. War's brutality also shaped England's governance. The massive expense of warfare drove increasingly sophisticated taxation systems and expanded royal authority. Edward I's wars against Scotland and Wales, Edward III's campaigns in France, all required unprecedented financial resources, leading to innovations in governmental record-keeping and fiscal extraction that ultimately strengthened state power at the expense of traditional liberties. As your eyelids grow heavier, consider this final, cruel irony. The very technological and organizational innovations that made medieval English warfare increasingly brutal also laid foundations for the modern world. The administrative systems developed to finance war evolved into more effective governance. The social mobility occasionally afforded to successful common soldiers, like Henry V's archers given land grants, gradually undermined rigid feudal hierarchies. Even the arms race between weapons and armor eventually contributed to gunpowder's adoption, ultimately rendering the armored knight obsolete. Medieval England's battlefields were crucibles where humanity's capacity for cruelty and innovation combined to produce ever more efficient ways of dealing death. Yet, in this dark laboratory of violence, the unintended byproducts, stronger states, technological advancement, and eventually social change would help forge the modern world from the blood-soaked soil of countless forgotten fields. As candlelight casts long shadows across your bedroom wall, let's turn our attention to those who often existed in the shadows of medieval English society itself, women and children. Their vulnerability wasn't merely circumstantial, but systematically encoded into the very structure of medieval life, a feature, not a bug, of a society built on hierarchies of power. From the moment of birth, a medieval English child entered a world that viewed them not as individuals to be nurtured, but as miniature adults to be molded, or more often, exploited. Childhood was brief, if it existed at all. By age 7, children were expected to contribute economically to their households. By 12, many were sent away to work as servants or apprentices. By 14, girls could be married. By 16, boys were considered men. Infant mortality hovered between 30 to 50%. Birth itself was extraordinarily dangerous, conducted without pain relief in the exclusively female space of the birthing chamber. Midwives, while skilled in traditional methods, lacked understanding of infection or complications. Should something go wrong, there were no emergency interventions. The mother, baby, or frequently both, would simply die. A woman giving birth in medieval England was engaged in an act nearly as dangerous as a man entering battle. For those children who survived birth, danger remained omnipresent. Archaeological evidence from medieval cemeteries reveals children's bones bearing signs of rickets, tuberculosis, and malnutrition. Broken bones, poorly set, infections that left permanent damage, smallpox scars. These physical markers tell a story of childhood defined by pain and vulnerability. The emotional landscape of medieval childhood was similarly harsh. Modern concepts of childhood as a protected period of development simply didn't exist. Children were viewed as inherently sinful creatures requiring strict discipline to shape them into proper adults. Corporal punishment wasn't just accepted, it was considered essential for proper development. Spare the rod and spoil the child wasn't merely a saying, but a fundamental pedagogical principle. Did you know that medieval educational texts explicitly instructed teachers to beat students, but cautioned against excessive force, not out of concern for the child's welfare, but because a student who was beaten too severely might abandon his studies altogether? The 13th century educator Hugh of St. Victor advised teachers to be frugal in punishment, not because beating children was wrong, but because too frequent beating might cause students to become hardened to blows, like asses. Perhaps most disturbing to modern sensibilities was the casual acceptance of child labor. From the age of 7, children worked alongside adults in fields, workshops, and households. In towns, young boys entered apprenticeships that bound them to masters for 7 to 10 years, during which they had few rights and were frequently subjected to physical abuse. Girls typically worked as domestic servants, vulnerable to exploitation and sexual abuse from employers and male household members. Child abandonment was common enough that it required systemic responses. Foundling hospitals emerged in larger towns to care for abandoned infants, though their mortality rates were appalling. At some institutions, up to 90% of children died before reaching adolescence. Abandonment wasn't always a result of callousness. Economic desperation drove many parents to surrender children they simply couldn't feed. For medieval women, vulnerability took different but equally pervasive forms. A woman's legal status was essentially that of property, passing from father to husband through marriage. Under the common law principle of coverture, a married woman's legal identity was subsumed into her husband's. She could not own property independently, make contracts, or bring legal cases in her own name. Marriage itself was primarily an economic transaction, arranged to benefit families rather than individuals. Women had little say in their marital fate, especially among the aristocracy, where marriages formed crucial political alliances, while peasant women had somewhat more input into their marriages. Economic necessity, rather than romantic attachment, typically drove these unions as well. Once married, a woman's primary purpose was childbearing, a duty both religiously mandated and practically necessary. In a society with high child mortality, women commonly experienced 10 or more pregnancies during their reproductive years, with each birth carrying significant risk of death or permanent injury. Church teachings promoted continuous childbearing by prohibiting contraception and requiring regular marital debt. Sexual intercourse, regardless of a woman's health or wishes. Domestic violence against women was sanctioned, both legally and culturally. A husband's right to chastise his wife with physical force was recognized in law, with courts intervening only in cases of extreme brutality resulting in serious injury or death. Folk wisdom offered advice on proper wife beating. One common saying suggested a man should use a stick no thicker than his thumb, possibly the origin of the rule of thumb, implying not that beating was wrong, but that it should be conducted with appropriate moderation. Widowhood offered a rare opportunity for female autonomy. A widow, particularly one with property, enjoyed legal rights denied to other women. She could conduct business, manage estates, and even practice trades otherwise closed to women. This relative freedom explains why some widows chose not to remarry despite the economic and social pressures to do so. It also explains why literature and folklore often portrayed widows with suspicion. Their independence threatened patriarchal control. Women's work, while essential to the household and broader economy, was systematically devalued. The brewing industry provides a telling example. In early medieval England, brewing was predominantly women's work, conducted at home as part of domestic production. As the commercial value of brewing grew, men gradually took over the industry, transforming it from brewing, women's work, to the ale industry, men's work. This pattern repeated across numerous economic sectors. When work became profitable, it tended to be masculinized. For both women and children, religious traditions offered mixed blessings. Christianity theoretically valued all souls equally, and church teaching sometimes protected the vulnerable prohibitions against infanticide, for instance, or rarely enforced condemnations of excessive violence against wives and children. Yet religious texts also provided justification for hierarchies that placed women and children firmly under male authority, citing Eve's original sin or biblical injunctions for wives to submit to husbands. Sexual violence against women operated within a complex legal framework that primarily protected male interests rather than female bodily autonomy. Rape was legally recognized as a crime, but prosecutions focused on the theft of virginity or violation of another man's property rights rather than the woman's consent or suffering. A woman bringing a rape accusation faced enormous hurdles. She needed to immediately raise the hue and cry, show physical evidence of violence, and often prove her previously spotless reputation. For peasant women working in fields and forests, sexual assault was an omnipresent danger with little recourse. Manorial courts occasionally record cases of sexually assaulted peasant women, but punishments for perpetrators were typically limited to fines paid to the lord for violating his property rights in his female tenant, rather than compensation to the victim herself. Children faced similar sexual vulnerabilities with even fewer protections. While church law established minimum ages for marriage, 12 for girls, 14 for boys, these were routinely circumvented through pre-contracts and betrothals established years earlier. Among the aristocracy, child marriages were common, with girls as young as 7 formally wed, though consumption of the marriage was theoretically delayed until puberty. These young brides, sent to live in their husbands' households years before sexual maturity, were particularly vulnerable to abuse. The intersection of poverty, gender, and age created especially dangerous conditions. During times of famine or economic hardship, young women and girls were sometimes driven to prostitution for survival. Though technically illegal, prostitution was tacitly accepted in most medieval towns, with authorities more concerned with regulating than eliminating the practice. Young prostitutes faced violence, disease, and social ostracism, with few alternatives once they entered the profession. Women accused of witchcraft represent perhaps the most extreme manifestation of female vulnerability in medieval England. While large-scale witch hunts came later, during the early modern period, medieval women, particularly older widows, midwives, or those with healing knowledge, could find themselves targeted by communities seeking scapegoats for misfortune. Accusations often reflected fear of female knowledge and autonomy as much as genuine belief in malevolent magic. Children born outside marriage suffered severe legal and social disabilities. Illegitimacy barred them from inheritance and many professions, including the clergy, though dispensations could be purchased. These children were literally designated children of nobody in legal terminology, with no right to support from their fathers, and bearing the stigma of their birth throughout their lives. As medieval England transitioned toward the early modern period, some legal reforms improved protections for women and children. Courts began treating extreme domestic violence more seriously, and educational opportunities gradually expanded. Yet, the fundamental structures rendering them vulnerable remained largely intact, woven into the very fabric of a society that viewed hierarchy and patriarchy as divinely ordained natural law rather than human constructions. When we contemplate medieval cruelty toward women and children, we confront not just individual acts of violence, but systematic vulnerability encoded in law, religion, and culture. Their suffering wasn't incidental, but foundational to a social order that distributed power along lines of gender and age as strictly as it did along divisions of class. Perhaps the greatest cruelty was this: the normalized, everyday nature of their subordination made it nearly invisible to contemporaries who saw not cruelty, but simply the natural order of things. For all its cruelty, medieval England wasn't populated by monsters, but by people who loved, who laughed, who sought meaning and connection, just as we do. They navigated their world with the tools and understanding available to them, trapped within systems of thought and power they rarely questioned, because they could scarcely imagine alternatives. When we judge them harshly, we risk missing this essential truth. They were us, separated only by fortune of birth and the accumulated knowledge of intervening centuries. Their capacity for both cruelty and kindness mirrors our own. The difference lies not in our nature, but in our nurture, in the social structures and shared wisdom that shape our possibilities. Perhaps that's the most valuable insight to carry with you as consciousness begins to blur at the edges, that the arc of human history, for all its horrific detours, has indeed bent gradually toward greater compassion, toward systems that increasingly recognize the inherent dignity of each person: the medieval peasant, the convicted thief, the woman in childbed, the orphaned child. They would find much about our world miraculous, not just in our technology, but in our expanded circle of moral concern. Their suffering wasn't in vain if it forms part of that long, halting journey toward a more humane world. So close your eyes now, and as medieval England recedes into the mists of near sleep, carry with you not nightmares, but gratitude for the comfortable bed beneath you, the medicine cabinet within reach, the legal protections you rarely think about, but daily rely upon. These aren't guaranteed by nature, but hard-won through centuries of human struggle and learning. Sweet dreams, time traveler.